Okay, so thank you very much. I want to thank Steve for organizing tonight and reaching out to me and all the other awesome speakers, two of which I already knew. I've been on a similar panel with Karen in the past. I used to work with Phil. But true story, I was actually going to take a break from doing these kinds of talks for a variety of reasons, but Steve reached out to me and he said, hey, would you like to talk about like Trump and Brexit? And so I was like, okay, fine. Can't resist that. So 2 points before we start. I'd like to apologize in advance for all the horrible photos of rich, horrible white men. They really are the worst. And I'm a former New Yorker, so I hope you don't give a fuck that I'm probably gonna fucking say fuck a lot. So, without further ado, I want to talk about propaganda in the modern world, and there are a number of different strategies and tactics and tools and different channels that propagandists are leveraging to their nefarious advantage. And I want to give a shout out to Tosh Wilcox, who's a fantastic illustrator and designer in lovely Manchester, who hooked me up with this amazing little sub-tour of all the things I intend to talk about tonight. So buckle up, it's going to be a bumpy ride. As with many horrible things in the modern world, a lot of this shit starts with Henry fucking Kissinger. And one of the things that Kissinger was sort of famous for was pioneering this idea of what he called constructive ambiguity. And it's a bit of a strange policy construct, but it's in its essence, it's weasel words. It's fudging sensitive issues, and it basically lets countries save face without actually solving any real problems, or in some cases, actually exacerbating tensions down the road. So a perfect example of constructive ambiguity was UN Security Resolution 242. Feel free to Google it. Which basically had two mutually exclusive principles embedded in it. And that policy and others like it has basically lit the fuse to what we see going on today in Syria. And we've got these fucks. So, fast forward about 10 years from Kissinger and some of those policies. They had explosive results even in the 80s. So at that point in time, there were a number of terror attacks that were happening. For the better part of 2 years, international intelligence agencies were basically saying, yeah, Syria fucking did it. And America was the sole country who were like, no, we think Libya did it. And basically, perception management was a technique in a way that the Reagan administration and others since basically create these sort of very simplistic narratives to get the American electorate to buy into aggressive foreign policy. So you have to remember back then, America had just sort of come out of what was still in a bit of a stupor because of the Vietnam War. People weren't eager to go tramping off to other parts of the globe and have this sort of cowboy international policy. But Reagan was able to sort of fabricate rogue states and crazy, wacky world leaders in a full cloth, which is great for the nightly news cycle. Anyone recognize the other fuck in the photo? Rupert Murdoch, ladies and gentlemen. Karl Rove is a complete scumbag, and he was instrumental in shoving the Overton window much further right in the 2000s. thus sort of creating the fertile soil that we saw the Tea Party grow out of, and now everyone in the Trump world. And he's basically, like a lot of other conservative American thinkers, a good example of what really dumb people think a smart person is like. And for purposes of this talk, he's best known for the idea of reality-based communities. So I'm going to read a quote, because I love reading to a packed audience. And this is from Ron Suskind, who is a journalist who was working in the policy area at the time. Rove said that guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. But that's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities which you can study too, and that's just how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. Fun. Reagan, Rove, and maybe even Kissinger are lightweights compared to this guy. Vladislav Surkov. Does that ring any bells at all to anyone in the room? Few people. So Surkov is Putin's most powerful gray cardinal. And before he was involved in politics, he was an advertising and PR professional. Has a fondness for avant-garde theater, and he basically took a lot of those techniques and applied them to policy for Putin. And under a pseudonym, he published this idea of what he calls nonlinear warfare. And it's real warfare, but it's also information warfare. And it's basically this tactic for destabilizing perception, destabilizing credibility. And journalist Peter Pomerantsev basically calls it a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused, a ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it's indefinable. Basically, you can't formulate a competing narrative because the narrative of these shitheels is constantly changing. It's designed to be confusing. It's designed to be surreal. Okay. So, fuckhead 1, fuckhead 2. We're all probably all too familiar with how Trump and Brexit are good examples of post-truth politics. But essentially the hallmark of that is the more outrageous the lie, the greater social and traditional media coverage you get. Barack Obama basically said that in the new media ecosystem, that means everything is true and nothing is true. We've all heard the adage, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. A modern version of that might be, a lie can dominate global news cycles while Facebook asks about outsourcing fact-checkers. So, let's talk about some of the tactics that ladder up to these strategies. Derision of experts was at the heart of Karl Rove's idea of reality-based communities, and it's become a key component of propaganda since. You've got this shit weasel basically saying, people in this country have had enough of experts, so fuck him. You've also got repetition, which has been a propagandist weapon in the propagandist arsenal since at least Goebbels. And basically, it remains a powerful tactic. You just repeat your claims over and over and over and over and over again, even after they've long been disproven. And so I think we can all point to that 350 million claim as a bullshit claim. And they kept saying it until the day after the fucking referendum. So thanks for that. Another common tactic is this feigned rejection of partisanship. That's Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. I also like to think that he kind of looks a little bit like a turtle. Not like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, more a geriatric mutant pedo turtle, maybe. I don't really know. But he's basically made a career out of this horseshit. He's under his leadership, the Republican Party has had strict party discipline. They never do anything in a bipartisan way, while lying about how fucking bipartisan they are, which is great. All roads lead back to this goddamn fucking bus. And it's because propagandists, they used to sort of trade in fear and panic and things like that, and they still do. But they're trying their hand at campaigning on utopian issues, right? So they're basically just making these fucking ridiculous promises based on lies that they have no fucking intention of delivering on, right? So, you know, that's a new thing they're trying to do, but they still haven't given up their old favorites and peddling darker notions. So conspiracism and belief in conspiracies is at an all-time high. Whether that's birtherism or QAnon or Pizzagate, I could go on and on. But they're purpose-built to radicalize people and to drive them to what's called stochastic terrorism. And lest we forget, a good example of that is when a guy came into the pizzeria that played into the Pizzagate narrative with an AR-15 rifle and shot the place up. And that brings us to Facebook. Yay, my favorite topic. The original sin of social media is programmatic advertising. And propagandists are using that to their utmost advantage to basically micro-target their lies for maximum impact and minimal spend. Russia's Internet Research Agency, it's kind of weird being in London talking about the IRA and meaning someone else completely different. But some sources say that they only spent $100,000 on their election interference campaign. And I think what's really alarming about how these guys are targeting this stuff is that it's deeply sophisticated and really nuanced. So they crafted messages based on users' race, gender, sexual orientation, religious belief, all sorts of things, right? But they also based them on their interests in things like the Tea Party, Malcolm X, funny pics, Maya Angelou, Fox News, all sorts of stuff. And the IRA and the election interference campaign really fixated on racial tensions sort of at a general level and with Black Lives Matter at a very particular level. And the most damning part about all of this is that they basically took real issues and real concerns and leveraged them to their own ends. So they took one of the most important parts of democracy, which is dissent, and they weaponized it. And finally, propagandists have also weaponized objectivity. In the 20th century, journalism prided itself on its objectivity. Groups like the BBC even have obligations to be impartial, to give fair and balanced airtime to all sides of an issue. And yet somehow this sucker has been on the BBC more than any other politician recently. The New York Times, CNN, they've all recently hired far-right extremists, neo-Nazis, climate change deniers, and depending on your POV, that's either a cynical cash grab or a terrifically misguided attempt at fairness. So, changing gears a little bit, going from those strategies and those tactics now down to some of the tools at a specific level. There are a lot of different tricks, a lot of different approaches that internet trolls and alt-right dickheads are leveraging stuff. But I want to shine a light on two in particular because they're especially relevant to recent events. The first is red pilling. You guys must be familiar with that idea, right? Show of hands. Yeah, a little bit. So it's this terrible thing that's sort of derived from that scene in The Matrix with the take the blue pill, take the red pill, take a bunch of pills. But it's this bullshit sort of copy pasta recruitment strategy that these extremists use to recruit at-risk people to join their bullshit nihilistic crusade. And shitposting is basically this tactic of just throwing out a huge amount of coded memes to confuse, distract, and aggravate your enemies while simultaneously entertaining, inspiring, and communicating with your allies. And the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter is an obvious example of that. Everything that we've been talking about, though, is signal boosted across social media. The fundamental business model of most of these platforms is advertising revenue. And when that is your sort of core business driver, that typically means that you then need more daily active users. You need more eyeballs to see more of your fucking ads. And sadly, outrage outperforms happiness on these platforms by leaps and bounds. And essentially, we click more when we're angry. We no longer live in an attention economy anymore, but rather we live in an outrage economy. And all this monstrous stuff has come to a head recently in Christchurch, where an alt-right terrorist murdered 50 people and injured dozens more. The attack was live-streamed on Facebook, broadcast to YouTube, and shared alongside his manifesto on Reddit, 4chan, 8chan, and dozens of other platforms. You could even download all of that shit from the Daily Mail. His media strategy was so complete and so expedient that, unlike a lot of other attacks like this, and sadly we have too many other attacks like this, there was no gap in the media cycle and coverage for copycat content to sort of emerge, which is terrifying. So, talking about a lot of dark shit, never comfortable. Aldous Huxley once said, "In regard to propaganda, the early advocates of universal literacy and a free press envisaged only two possibilities. That propaganda might be true, or that propaganda might be false. They did not foresee what in fact has happened, above all in our Western capitalist democracies, the development of a vast mass communications industry concerned in the main neither with the true nor the false, but with the unreal, the more or less totally irrelevant. In a word, they failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions." So that's all pretty terrible, right? And so I think we have to ask ourselves, what can we do as consumers, as creators, and as a society to fix this, right? Because we have to fix it. We can't just throw in the towel like Facebook has done recently with their disingenuous pivot to privacy. So I think as individuals, we can take steps to break the breaking news cycle. Studies have shown that people who have gone cold turkey from social media are slightly less informed, but significantly more happy. And we need to acknowledge that there's a fundamental difference between how we consume the news, right? There's a difference between right now and right. And we have to ask ourselves, how can we find ways to consume news slower, more responsibly, more accurately? And I think the first step in all of that is turning your notifications right the fuck off. As a society, we need to educate people on how to live in this sort of media-saturated world. How many of you in your education background had media literacy courses? I count like maybe 10 hands. This is a room of 250 odd people. There are different approaches to media literacy, but one thing they all have in common is an emphasis on critical thinking and analysis. Media literacy is designed to teach people how to understand the power structures that shape media representations of a number of different issues, and the way that audiences and producers derive and create meaning from the images and words that they use. It asks who benefits, and with an event like the Christchurch shooting, even sharing the video or manifesto, or even naming that fucking terrorist bolsters his agenda. Media literacy by itself isn't going to be enough. This is all accelerating because of technology and because of digital platforms. So we need to start teaching everyone from school-age kids on up about algorithmic literacy too. Why are these systems making the recommendations that they are making? Why are they showing the content that they are showing? And as designers and technologists, we need to start making these systems more transparent for the people that use them, to give them more control over those inputs. And as designers and technologists, we have to acknowledge that hate speech is not free speech. There are a number of different things that we could do, and that if you happen to work at any of these big social platforms that I know you guys are working on, but we need more progress ASAP. We can enforce existing terms and services evenly and fairly. I've been in Facebook jail once or twice. Don't think Donald Trump ever has been. We can apply the same approaches to erasing white radical extremist content that these platforms use to censor ISIS. Thank you. We need better definitions of protected groups. Facebook has definitions of protected groups that you can't sort of say bad things about. I'm that protected group on Facebook. White men are a protected group. Muslim children are not. Black women are not. This is fucking bullshit. We need better definitions of protected groups. We need better algorithms to detect hate speech. There's all this controversy about how platforms are shadow banning and downranking hateful content. Do more of that, please. Thank you. And we need to better distinguish between fake dissent and real dissent, right? And we have to protect real dissent. So whatever solutions people at these companies come up with, they have to sort of take into account that this sort of troll dissent has patterns and weird inconsistencies that are detectable. And finally, we need to create new networks with new business models. That all starts by challenging this lazy assumption that advertising has to be the fucking model for everything. That as a result of that, everything has to have enormous fucking communities behind it. None of that is true. There are other models, from subscriptions to software as a service kind of stuff, to direct revenue, to direct consumer sales. The most successful companies have multiple business models, and it just makes good business sense to diversify revenue streams, business models, and metrics away from propaganda. So thank you.